Hello, I'm Haiyan. Oh, hello. Great to be here, great to be speaking about this topic of crowdsourced science. First, a little bit about myself. So I call myself a designer and technologist. My background is in software engineering, and in more recent years, I've become an innovation and design specialist working at the consultancy IDEO. At IDEO, I co-founded a platform called Open IDEO, which is an open innovation platform where challenges for social good are posted up, and a community of over 50,000 innovators, designers, creatives come online and solve that challenge together through a design thinking process. More recently, I left IDEO, and now I run an innovation lab at Microsoft Games. We are a new gaming studio called Lift London, where I'm working with a team to push the edges of technology and create new play and entertainment experiences. So today, I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about crowdsourced science. So this is... these are a set of learnings and a story of my experiences in the aftermath of the Japan earthquake. So in March 2011, there was a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami in Japan. This resulted in the devastation of large number of cities, as well as the eventual nuclear meltdown of the Daiichi Fukushima power plant. And at the time, within Japan, there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of panic about what was happening. The government was not releasing information in a very clear way, and so the public were rushing out and buying iodine tablets, or there was a lot of rumor going on. So one of the first things that I did, being in London, very far away from Japan, was I wanted to contribute to this effort in some way. So I decided to take a look at the data that was available online for radiation readings that were already existing in Japan. And the first thing that I realized was that data is not the same as information. So the Japanese government did have a scientific sensor network that was monitored by an official body, that data was being made publicly available on the internet in PDF documents. So what you could do is, if you clicked around the Japanese official government website, you would eventually come upon a set of links that were PDFs that you could then download. It's amazing how they created an automated system to generate PDFs for you to download. Wouldn't it have been easier to make that just regular, some kind of feed or a text on a web page? That would have been much easier to process than a PDF. So there was already a network of sensors on the ground. As you can see, these are sensors around the actual Fukushima Daiichi power plant. They list 8 sensors in all. And there was also a network of volunteers online. So myself and a number of people that I'd never met, just all sort of at the same time said that we wanted to do something to help the situation, to make information more transparent. And volunteers came online and started processing this information and feeding it into an online platform called Patchbay. So these PDFs were processed by essentially Google Docs. And then Google Docs, it was automated to go into Patchbay. And then from there, Patchbay was basically an aggregator of data. So I started taking that data and building a design in order to to convey the information of what was happening on the ground. And so what you can see here is Japan, and on top of that map are sensors spread throughout Japan. And these are a mix. These have now become a mix of government sensors and also individuals who've connected their radiation, their Geiger counters online onto Patch Bay as well. So through the Patch Bay network, all these sensors were aggregated, and then my map was taking that data and mapping it, and also I was trying to convey some kind of meaningful information. I think when you are trying to design for something like radiation readings, it's very difficult to not have your politics come into play. Either you are for or against nuclear energy, and I think the design reflects that in some way. So I actually tried very hard to not make a judgment on nuclear energy, and also not to cause panic, because I think from the map you could see that that there was actually not that much danger for people in Tokyo, for people in the metropolitan areas outside of the power plant region itself. And people didn't understand this. So one of the first things I did was I did a lot of research and calculated the baseline background radiation in Japan, and then color-coded anything below the baseline to be white, and then above the baseline in gradations of yellow, orange, and red. What's most interesting is that you can see the radiation readings around the power plant itself. So this was very fascinating to actually be able to drill into the power plant and see what the readings were. Another aspect that I didn't sort of think of initially was that this essentially became a live weather map of radiation in Japan. And over a number of hours, you could literally see gusts of wind blowing radioactive matter down the coast. So on this map, you can see time-lapse where wind is carrying radioactive particles down the coast, and you can see that those sensors are registering elevated readings. So this map was launched within days of the earthquake. It was one of the first maps out there, and I think one of the more comprehensive or considered. So it got picked up by a lot of publications and news networks within Japan. Within about 2 months, I had 500,000 page views, which is pretty impressive, given that it is not a page featuring cats or music by the Beastie Boys. I also received a lot of tweets and messages of support from people. A lot of people in Japan said that it had become part of their day to wake up in the morning and check this map to make sure that the radiation around them was safe. So in thinking about the design aspect of this map, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to get people curious about the readings and to do the research themselves. So I wanted people to be able to click on each reading, drill down, and click further to understand a bit more about what was going on. One thing that became apparent very quickly is this idea of crowdsourcing, especially in science, because I think the crowd in crowdsourcing is a double-edged sword. I had a conversation with Jeff Howe, who was actually the co-author on the original Wired article that coined the term crowdsourcing. So I had a conversation with him some time ago, and he said, when we initially came up with the term crowdsourcing, we didn't mean it to be completely complementary, because there is a tension between getting lots of points of data or lots of points of opinion and then finding the right quality of opinion or the right quality of data from potentially all of that noise. So I think when it comes to crowdsourced science, the crowd is a double-edged sword. People have a perceived trust of a system where there seemed to be a network of independent suppliers of the data. But when it comes to science, there needs to be a lot of rigor. When you're taking those measurements, there needs to be a lot of calibration. And when you have this independent network, sometimes that rigor is not followed. When the news stories of the Japan Geiger map were picked up, the headlines, and this is something about our media today, the headline that people really picked up on was the idea of crowdsourcing, that radiation readings were being crowdsourced and therefore independent from the government and perceived to be more trustworthy. In actual fact, the majority of sensors out there were part of the official government network, just because there weren't that many Geiger counters on the ground. So here I have, you can filter the map by government readings and then by, what's this one? By individual readings. So in all there are about 27 Geiger counters on the ground in Japan versus, what is this, 200 counters from the government. Not to say that this is not a crowdsourced effort, because this actually took a lot of effort for individuals to process that data and make it publicly available so that other people could design maps with it. Here's another interesting story about the crowd being a double-edged sword. I have a friend who set up a Geiger counter in Tokyo. And he set it up in his, I think it was on his back porch, and it rained a lot, and there was a leak, and water started leaking onto the Geiger counter, and so it started going crazy. You can see that, you know, in the middle of Tokyo, there is some kind of radioactive, yeah, there's a bit of a problem. So because there was overall a lack of sensors on the ground, this one reading really freaked a lot of people out. You know, people were tweeting, they were saying what was going on. So you can see there's this tension in the system where people, they want to trust the independent network, but at the same time, sometimes the independent network can have invalid nodes, and it's difficult for a designer to come in and say, or design a system where we don't show the invalid nodes, because every piece of data we consider to be valid. So the onus is really on the viewer, the reader, to investigate further rather than to jump to conclusions. So speaking of quality over quantity, you can see one of the problems with radiation mapping in Japan is just the lack of good sensors, the lack of actual sensors on the ground. So at this point, I was put in touch with an organization called Safecast, whose mission was to create open source Geiger counters and to distribute them throughout Japan and to create a network where data and maps could be generated. So I went to Tokyo and participated in some workshops around how we could create Geiger counters and how we could crowdsource this data. At the time, there was a lack of due to the lack of number of sensors, because we only had a couple of Geiger counters, the group basically strapped them to the side of a car and drove them around Japan in order to take measurements. So I went along on one of these trips. So this is us driving through some of the towns that are close to the evacuation zone. And this gentleman here wearing the face mask, we thought he was kind of, you know, not being very polite to the locals. He was kind of freaking people out. We were like, what are you doing? These people, you know, this is a suburb, people live here, and you show up with a gas mask. So we drove all day, and then we surveyed some of the devastation along the coast. And by nightfall, we arrived at this town called Koriyama, where the locals had been volunteering to measure radiation. So they are a town on the edge of the evacuation zone, which means that because they fall outside of the evacuation zone, the Japanese government would not give them support to leave their houses. So they were stuck there. They said that scientists had come in government trucks, taken measurements, said nothing, and then left. So they were very thankful that they had 1 or 2 Geiger counters that we had given them. So I went to one of the residents, his back porch, and we were measuring his back porch. This is his family with his 2-year-old daughter. On his back porch, he had a wooden deck. It had rained a lot. And his wooden deck had soaked up a lot of radioactive particles that had blown over from the power plant. And you can see that his deck was basically giving off a lot of radiation, and he didn't actually not know this, and he said that morning they had had a picnic on the deck. So that is a very long way to go from looking at a map all the way in London to going to someone's house and seeing them directly affected by this this event. How am I doing for time, James?
You're doing okay. It's interesting stuff. So.
Great. Perfect. I have another video I want to play. I just realized I didn't plug any sound in. So should we try it?
Go for it.
Let's go. Okay. Can you guys hear it? So this is about Safecast and what they're doing with the Geiger counters.
So the three of us are just talking, where can we find information? Oh, we can't find radiation data anywhere, and it's not because it's not being published, it's because it doesn't exist. Nobody was paying attention to this stuff. And so that's when we decided that we could start pooling our resources to get equipment in people's hands, and go collect some of this data and publish it so that there would at least be something available. Within a week, we had 20, 25 people all in this Skype chat room brainstorming and trying to figure out a solution to this problem.
We're looking online and we couldn't get any Geiger counters. Literally within 24 hours, the whole world supply was sold out. When we realized that we couldn't get the equipment, we decided that the only way to get this done is let's go and build it ourselves. So we came up with the idea that if we put a Geiger counter on a car and we drive around with it, we can collect radiation and put it on the map. Only problem was is we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the system. So the solution was go to Tokyo Hackerspace, where there's lots of people that knew how to put things together, and on the 6th day after we had the idea, we had a working system. The next day we were off to Fukushima doing our first measurements.
As we started taking measurements, we saw that a reading can change like 100% just by crossing a street. And that's when we realized that it was really important for us to take very granular street-by-street readings every 5 seconds and publish really granular data so that people can drill all the way down and see exactly what the reading is right in front of their house, not an average of an entire city.
After a couple of months, we realized that it would be much better for volunteers to have something that would be very concise and compact. As we redeveloped the whole system, and we were able to use Arduinos and open hardware to fit it into a bento box, and that's how we came up with the bento Geiger system. Once we built one, we taught other people to build many more of them, and that really allowed us to scale it dramatically.
Wow, this is a disaster. This is a tremendous opportunity to take this tons of data that's being collected and try to understand what the effects on people is. That can only happen if we share the data and we put the medical data together with the radiation data. And right now the key to combining data is to make it open. And so one of the really important features of the Safecast project is we're using a CC0 public domain dedication for all of the data so that we can try to get people to do data science on it. We found out from Fukushima the experts really weren't very helpful, and in fact that citizen science actually works. We were able to collect more data than all the projects in history, and a lot of scientists came together, and by pulling through the network we were able to become the best in the world. So I think what Safecast proves is that all the preparation in the world, all the money in the world still fails if you don't have a rapid, agile, resilient system. Because of the internet, because of our agility, because of our openness, within weeks we had the world's experts together to do this, and within a year we're the biggest project that has ever existed in this kind of monitoring. And I think it really shows that with the right people and the right resources and agility, you can beat the pants off of any government pre-planning or institutional system.
Right. One final note, and this is my final thoughts on crowdsourced science, which is the idea of garbage in, garbage out. So when we are setting forth to do science in an independent, crowdsourced way, the quality of the sensor is so important. And at the moment, the availability of sensors that can do scientific level sensing is not as prevalent. So as an example, I traveled to Boston earlier this year to do a hackathon with the Safecast guys, where they looked at air pollution sensing. So one of the thoughts that we had was to take high quality pollution sensors, attach them to drones, and have them fly around and detect air pollution. Also deliver your Amazon packages at the same time. So one of the problems with air quality sensing is that the commercially available sensors right now that are cheap are not able to really detect pollution to a standard that any scientific body would be happy with to evaluate. So now the group is working on, can we make cheaper sensors that have improved calibration? Can we use algorithms instead of hardware to improve upon the readings that are being captured? Because as we can see, the US Embassy has air quality sensors on, I believe, on the roofs of every embassy in China, and it's amazing how much disruption one sensor can make in a country. And so I would urge that one aspect to look at is just there needs to be disruption done in terms of the actual design and creation of new kinds of sensors, making them accessible to regular people to do this kind of crowdsourced science. And thank you very much. If you want to purchase a Geiger counter, the second link, Nano Express, you can buy a kit and solder it together yourself. Thank you.